Okay, great. Thank you all for coming. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to Imperial College London. This event is co-organised between the Grantham Institute here at Imperial College and the Grantham Research Institute at LSE, our sister institute. It's our pleasure today, particularly to welcome Ian Duncan, an MEP who's come across from Brussels to join this event for us. He's a Conservative delegation's chief whip and spokesman on fisheries, energy and climate change in the European Parliament. But also of particular interest to this event is that he's the rapporteur on the Phase 4 revisions of the EU ETS and has hopefully some helpful thoughts to share with us in general on the EU emissions trading system. We have a wider panel here, and I'll go from my left onwards. Here we have Adam Whitmore, who has been a special policy advisor to Sandbag and previously in charge of environmental issues at Rio Tinto, and is now here in his personal capacity, but of course still has strong links and does some work for Sandbag and around issues of EU emissions trading systems as well. Next we have Ralf Martin, who's an associate professor here at the business school and has done a lot of relevant research on the EU emissions trading system and what that's delivered in terms of innovation and other benefits. Again, Mirabelle Muuls, also associate professor at the business school. They've done some research together on this topic. And at the end, we have Baran Doda, who's joining us from the London School of Economics, from the Grantham Research Institute, where he's done relevant research on linking emissions trading systems and also thinking about options in terms of how we can get emissions down in the industry and electricity sectors, currently part of the EU ETS, but what would other options be upon leaving the EU from the UK perspective. How it's going to work today, it's great that Ian's joined us, but he has a limited schedule when he's lucky enough to be in London from Brussels. So he's going to give us his thoughts on the EU ETS in general and options post-Brexit for about 20 minutes. And then we're going to have 20 minutes of questions. Then he's going to make a discreet exit. And we're going to continue. Each of the other panelists are going to give us their thoughts for about 7 minutes or so. We're going to follow that up with a bit of a discussion between the panelists and some questions, further questions from the audience. So that's the running time for today. If you missed the opportunity for biscuits and now having heard the running time, you really feel you need some sugar, go grab some biscuits and sit back down. Otherwise, it's my pleasure to introduce Ian Duncan.
I'm in your hands in some respect because I feel that the questions might be more instructive than what I have to say, but let me try and outline some of the key elements which I think might guide our discussion. First things first, Paris has changed the world. I was at the Paris gathering. I didn't see it coming. I didn't believe we would get 2 degrees centigrade with a nod toward 1.5 anywhere near the final communique, and yet we did. Problem with Paris for the rest of the EU is they haven't caught up with Paris. So at the moment we're still labouring under what are in effect pre-Paris targets and pre-Paris conditions. That's a reminder and a portent of one of the problems which I'm going to touch upon about Brexit, which is that member states are much slower to move when it comes to the money side of the things rather than when it comes to the promotion of good ideas. But Brexit. I didn't see Brexit coming either. So I literally, somewhat complacently, didn't watch any of the results come in. I went to bed. I was appearing the next day at the Royal Highland Show. I had a stall as an MEP. I was literally awakened by a little thing in the front of my phone that simply said, I didn't see that coming. And it was my member of staff who was literally also shocked to see that. And of course in Scotland, as you'll be aware, the result was quite different from the rest of the UK, so perhaps it's excusable that I didn't see it coming. 60-40 voted there to remain inside the EU. Now, let me just then talk to you a bit about the emissions trading scheme. When I first took on this dossier, I remember a discussion with my assistant saying, that'll never work. There's no way that's going to work. Why should we get involved in that? That's just got catastrophe written all over it. That will be a bureaucratic nightmare of epic proportions and will make a stumbling progress and frankly get nowhere. I'm not so far from still thinking many of those things to be true, in fact, if I'm being perfectly frank with you. A couple of things have stood out to me in the discussions that I've been part of during the last 18 months. The first thing is that all EU states are equal, but some are more equal than others. That's the first thing. And what you witness across the EU 28 is the ability of certain states to hold to hostage the rest. And I'm normally able to break up, if you like, the groupings which you find within the EU. So the Nordics themselves, you can usually see where they are, that's fine. Then you get old Europe, and then you get what I call the COCs. And these basically are those who have coal, communism, and keep the lights on. Those three particular elements therefore define much of Eastern Europe, and also describe some of their attitude to much of what we discuss in general. The issue, therefore, is how do you reconcile, in effect, what are very distinct energy markets, very distinct generating systems, very distinct and necessarily politically distinct units which need to be bought off at different points. Now, to give you an example of how that would work, we look again here in the West, and if we look at the situation in the UK, we see success. We are decarbonising at a rate that we have never seen before. Scotland, my constituency, is decarbonising significantly. Our last coal-fired power station has closed down. We are not producing carbon at the rate we were before. Turn your eyes toward Poland, and you'll recognise that they're in a dilemma. They are dependent upon Soviet-era technology. They are dependent upon primarily not hydrocarbons, but carbon. And the prospects that they have to make step shift changes, muted at best. And if you ever have the temerity to discuss carbon capture and storage to them, you'll realise that they're vehemently opposed to it as well. So even the one piece of technology that would allow them to embrace this new decarbonising world, they set their face against. And they do quite happily do that. The UK then, what does Brexit mean for the carbon markets? The UK offers three things right now to the EU, which I think are not only important, but in some respects critical to the wider energy question, and specifically to the carbon market question. The first thing I think is leadership. And for all the condemnation there's been about the UK being a lukewarm European, actually, more often than not, it is in the vanguard of trying to bring about the change which the EU would seek to embrace. And again, as Cagnetti, the Commissioner for Energy, basically said, the UK is part of the high ambition coalition. It has always set very high ambitions, and it lives to those ambitions. Others set very high ambitions and never quite managed to make it toward them. Therein resting a huge particular dilemma. So leadership is one of the first ones. The second one, and I think is perhaps the most critical one, is burden share. So the UK itself has targets which it meets. It has set itself high targets. It's 17% above where the EU itself would be in general. Now, you can argue about whether those targets can be met in the short term, but they are ambitious targets. And if you look at the balance, therefore, of the averages, if you subtract the UK from that, then the average falls for the rest of the EU. The burden share becomes more of a challenge for the remaining states. The UK shoulders a greater part of the burden. The final part, money. The UK puts in a shit ton of cash into the EU in every possible way that it can. And inside the carbon trading system, it does so through its allowances, which it gives to primarily a fiscal transfer to Eastern Europe. Now, depending upon the value of the carbon at any given point, that can be between 2, 3, upwards billion pounds at a given point. That's a substantial amount of money. And that money fits into the areas we'd expect, which are the solidarity mechanisms, the funds, the Innovation Fund, the Modernisation Fund, even the new fund, which is called the Just Transition Fund. Each of those will be primarily dependent upon cash from the UK. Take away the cash, create a problem for the rest of the funds. They don't work without the UK's money. It's almost as simple as that. And a lot of the support, you'll be aware, this has been discussed now recently in the agreement reached in Council. Not everyone loved the agreement in Council. There are a number of member states who seem to take their eye off the ball for but a small moment and suddenly the ball was in the back of the net. They didn't know what had happened to them. And they right now are very unhappy the ball is where it is. And they'll be even more unhappy when they discover, in fact, if the UK goes and takes money with it, there'll be far less money available to them for the things they would seek to do. Again, the carbon markets are not just about a market. They are something completely different, which is a subsidy mechanism for decarbonisation by other means. Now, you can argue whether that is a healthy thing or not, but it's completely different from the market. That's nothing to do with the market, except the value of the fiscal transfers is linked to the market. So the more the market generates excitement and the price rises, then the more money goes to Eastern Europe, theoretically. So the challenge then is what happens next. The UK will Brexit. I still hear people using the word if. There's no if, it's when. That is going to happen. What is less clear, I suppose, is whether the UK is going to exit from all the different elements that the EU represents. Now, I would passionately argue that it shouldn't exit a great number of those, but no one's listening to me, so that's not necessarily the right person to talk to. But I started the journey when I looked at the carbon market question by saying that the EU and the UK should work together. The UK should not exit the carbon markets. That was my initial position. I no longer believe that. No, I don't believe that. And I'm going to explain to you why I don't believe that. And it's born of experience. I don't believe the method we currently have in the EU for determining policy when it comes to carbon markets is anything other than a horror. As someone who has been knee-deep in this now for 18 months, I can assure you it is awful. It is not the way you want to set policy. Now, let me bring you into a secret, but don't tell anyone this. Just before the plenary vote, at that point, I called it a Jenga tower, this agreement that I had brokered, each piece resting upon another piece, but precariously, was still holding. Right up until two things happened. The right of centre group wanted the cement border clause removed. Absolutely, they wanted it out of there. And I'm being technical, but let's call it the left of centre wanted to have a rebasing approach to how how we should begin to set the foundation for the carbon market itself. Now, that was a bugger, as far as I'm concerned. Because I was literally thinking, I've got this thing precariously set. This just about holds together now. And I've got the right of centre trying to pull at one of the lower blocks, and I've got the left of centre trying to pull at one of the lower blocks as well. This will topple over, and all will be lost. The right of centre, as it transpired, had the votes. The left of centre didn't have the votes. Bizarrely, the left of centre thought they had the votes, which is even more surreal. If you're going to bluff, you have to leave the game before your cards are shown. The left of centre didn't. Because oddly enough, just before the vote, the right of centre put a whole lot of stuff on the table and said, just here, all of these things, just take rebasing away. We'll give you all of these things right now. Take rebasing off the table. And the left of centre went, no, we've got the votes. And as it happened, they didn't. They didn't have the votes at all. Not within a country mile of the votes. So I'm left thinking again, this is like some kind of grand poker game. How on earth can we decide policy on this basis? That's dopey. That's daft. So my view right now is this is phase 4 reform coming forward. Remember again, the Market Stability Reserve, when that was discussed, everyone said, everyone recognised there are far too many allowances in the system. We need to dry them up. But not today, and not tomorrow. The Commission suggested 2021. There were some who were suggesting 2020 was far too soon. Some of my Polish colleagues were really thinking about never. Was their basic promise of that. I wanted 2017. My view was, if you want to dry them up now. Instead, we've got 2019. Now, we're already beginning to reform, through the phase 4 adjustment, the Market Stability Reserve that hasn't even begun yet, because that doesn't begin for another 2 years. So we're at the stage now of reforming a reform that hasn't actually started. That's daft. That's inconsistent. That doesn't make any sense. That is a bizarre way to make law. So what you have left, I would argue, is a cumbersome method that is too slow, that does not in any way respond to reality, and quite often is overtaken by events before it even begins, which, to my mind, ultimately defeats the point of trying to make law which is sensitive to reality. So, as I now consider what I think is best for the UK, I've written down, I think there are 4 options as we go forward, which could be in play. One is in, as we are now. We are inside, we broadly keep it consistent with where we are. The reason I think that's not got legs, even setting aside my own opinion, is broadly the European Court of Justice jurisdiction sits inside that, and the Prime Minister said we will not be under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. That's one part of that. Next one, out, but we build our own separate emissions trading scheme. Now, we could do that, certainly. Out with our own separate emissions trading scheme that we link in to the EU. That's the third option, which we could certainly do. And the last option is out, and we just say, carbon trading is not the way forward. We just basically use a carbon tax. Now, bearing in mind that the emissions trading scheme is born of an inability at a European level to create a unified and harmonised tax, because tax is the one area that you can't get agreement at an EU level. So those are the 4 options which I think are basically in play for the UK. But the thing I come back to, and it is, again, what I hinted at before, it is all but impossible right now to make good policy, because everybody wants a little bit of something else in play. And the jurisdictions which we're talking about are so manifestly different that to try and bring them together at all is amazing, but it doesn't work very well when it comes to making the law good, making the law work. So much of my time going forward in the trilogues that will start on the 4th of April will be about how to create a solidarity mechanism to ensure that Poland is happy. Nothing about carbon markets particularly. This is just about a solidarity mechanism. How do we create a situation in which we can transfer a large amount of money from the West to the East? That's nothing to do with the functionality or the architecture of the trading scheme or the functionality of the carbon market itself. That is just a simple device to transfer cash. If you look at the trading schemes, which I think do work and work well, a lot of them learned the lessons the easy way. They looked at what the EU was doing and thought, not that, that's bizarre, don't do that, we'll do it differently. They are usually unitary jurisdictions. They are therefore in possession of the ability to do all the things they require themselves. Most of them have a government or a regional government who are able then to take decisions based upon a mandate, which allows them to move in real time. They don't have to accommodate or apply a lowest common denominator approach, nor do they have to recognize what is the vast diversity of energy generation inside the EU. Most of them, again, don't have the same issue of carbon leakage, which we might have as a continent. So in those particular situations, it is possible for governments, by mandate through their parliament structures, to set thresholds, to adjust thresholds in far more sensible, real-time manners. It's quite conceivable, again, that you could move where the targets of a Paris-type agreement to move again. You could see how a member state working in its own jurisdiction could change that. Cast your eye towards the 28, and even now we haven't got them to accept Paris at all, which is bizarre. So that almost sounds like I've gone Trumpian on you, which is that we can't possibly do it at a multilateral level. We can. It's just that it's not that easy to do. And if you're looking to make progress in an area where progress has to be made fast, the emissions trading scheme mechanism that we have today isn't it. All the stuff I'm doing will happen in 2021. 2 years after the Market Stability Reserve comes in 2019. 2 years after the UK potentially exits, the emission trading scheme itself, thereby undermining the emissions trading scheme, and meaning that before 2021, that reform will have to be reformed. So we're going to have to reform the reform before the reform begins, 2 years after the reform of the Market Stability Reserve, which itself is going to be reformed by the later reform. We've gone through the looking glass. This is madness as a way of trying to determine what we probably all agree is the single most important threat facing humanity now, and we are talking about this as if it's some kind of juggling trick done with bizarre and invisible balls. This is not the way to make this law. So I would argue right now, if the UK government were being clever, and if they were listening to me, which they're not, I hasten to add, but were they listening to me, I would advocate dislocating from the emissions trading scheme as it's currently constructed, focusing upon creating a single jurisdiction for the UK and immediately linking it back in as best you can into the EU, but allowing the movement, the change and the rhythm to be set by the British government, the targets to be set, and therefore to be moved in real time to allow for that. I think that would give us a far more sensitive system. Now I hear people who say, but the minute you start doing that, the whole thing falls apart. But the problem that I have right now is the thing is barely holding together, to the point at which we have a carbon market that isn't really a good market. We have a carbon price that, frankly, is an irritant, not a driver of change. And we see nothing that will change that. I've not heard any single NGO applaud the work I've done and say, my goodness, you've done a really good job. They've all said, you are dreadful, this is awful, what you've missed, the opportunities. I was thinking, yeah, welcome to my world here, folks. I'm trying to move different people all across a political spectrum toward a very small gateway I think I can get them through. And I was pleased to get them through the gateway. And then, of course, the council decided to have a higher ambition than I could set. So I'm fully aware of the challenges that I have tried to wrestle with. I wouldn't want to do that again. And I don't think the EU should either. Final point on that, MEPs, by their nature, are not good at technical dossiers. We're not detail people. We rely upon detail people to help us understand the detail. This dossier is getting more and more technical. We are getting to the stage where we are barely keeping a hold of reality in the way this goes forward, and we are not well equipped at that. And so we end up reverting back to what are either mantras or high-level claims that we ourselves are not able to understand when we have to drill down into the reality. And I think if you talk to any MEP for more than 10 minutes and ask more questions than perhaps the shallow level, you begin to recognise that person knows bugger all about this particular topic. And wholly reliant upon, and I've lost my assistant, so I know what I've lost, because we were like the Borg. I was using his mind to help me be clever, and I've lost that part now, so I'm struggling to try and wrestle with some of the realities I thought I knew inside out, but relied upon somebody else who knew them inside out. So again, the EU is not good at technical stuff, just isn't. And what we end up doing is we then devolve that down to a level of technicians where we try and then steer it as politicians, and we're ill-equipped to do that. So, I could do this all day. I'm going to stop there. I think you may have questions which you want to ask. Very happy to take them on any aspect of this, Brexit, or indeed the Scottish referendum, if you want to throw it in for a bit of laughter. Why not? Happy to do that as well. But please be aware that I am, despite my seeming reticence in this, still fully committed to try and getting the EU emissions trading scheme to work. That is my purpose while I remain inside the EU, and I will be there until I am let go, which I think will be sometime now, apparently, 2019. Thank you.
Thank you, great. That was fantastically fluid and interesting discourse on the subject. What I promised the panelists here is that they get the chances to throw the first few questions, and then we'll open it out to the audience. That gives you and the audience a bit of a chance to compose your thoughts. Shall we start? No, who's aching to go? Well, shall I start with Adam, since you're sitting right next to us there?
Thanks, Ian. That was very interesting. You mentioned towards the end of the council decision, assuming the UK does leave the EU ETS, you'll have a surplus which is larger as a proportion of the remaining market. Yeah. And it seems to me in that world that the MSR and the reforms of the MSR take on even greater importance, or the reforms, if you prefer. Given that the council is now proposing a size limit on the MSR as well as the increased transfer rate, do you think that, as well as the increased transfer rate, is something that you and indeed the wider Parliament can now support?
Yes, probably. I think the curious thing is that the Council is more ambitious than the Parliament seems to have been. That is certainly true. But the architecture of the agreement is primarily of the Parliament's construction. So when we're talking again about how the MSR might well work and what we can talk about in terms of increasing the rate coming in or cancellations and so on, those are broadly on our side of the pitch. We were able to see the architecture of doing that. There will be surpluses, and we need to find a way of drying them up, because both as a consequence of Brexit, that will be a reality, but also, and this is where I've made this point to everybody who will listen, and that's very few, all our other policies by their nature tend to create a surplus. We tend to create, by our decarbonising policies, an excess of carbon allowances, because we don't need them as much. So we need to find a way of, as best we can, forecasting how many will become redundant during the process of decarbonising by the other policies that we have in play. And that holistic approach is simply anathema to the Commission, because it requires really sensitive thinking and work to try and make this happen, and real-time adjustment of the MSR, which we don't really have. The architecture should now allow, hopefully, a forecast of what the rate should look like to help. But it's actually, and I know how it was constructed, we picked a number and thought that's where we thought it would go. We didn't base it upon any of the underpinning science, because it wasn't any. We just picked a number we thought would fly, and that's the number we ended up with. So again, I come back to this notion of technology, of how technical things can be. I don't believe right now that the Commission has got the wherewithal to do this. And they're not going to build it, because they still live in silos, and therefore will be a huge ongoing problem. And that's, again, when they're being successful. The Commission has been successful at putting forward laws which decarbonise at a greater rate, but they've not been able to recognise the consequences for the emissions trading scheme. In an ideal world, eliminate all the other laws and just use the emissions trading scheme. Or eliminate the emissions trading scheme and just use the other laws. Do either way. But what you're doing right now is one is undermining the other. So we have a problem ongoing. There's no solution to it yet.
Right, excellent. Ralf, your turn.
Well, my main question would be, I mean, you're basically, you're proposing that the UK goes it alone, which will maybe, if we are very lucky, and we might be very unlucky, but if we're lucky, it creates a nice sort of carbon tax, which is sort of well thought through and well targeted and based on evidence and so on and so forth. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's about addressing climate change. And we can only, if the UK decarbonizes by itself, that's not going to happen. And I mean, what you're proposing to go, if the UK goes it alone, then that can only undermine the EU ETS, as you were just saying. It causes more trouble, more reform, more debate, which undermines the ETS, and therefore, makes solving climate change as a whole much less likely than if you would stay in. So I don't, I mean, I sort of appreciate that we would have a nice sort of policy framework, and I can certainly see the fascination for that. But at the end of the day, we have to look at what the target is, you know. And also, I wouldn't necessarily share your pessimism about the ETS as such. Of course, if you're sort of in all of these negotiations, there is a lot of chaos and a lot of incoherence. But at the end of the day, I mean, we are now in year 12 or whatever of the trading system. We had for most of that period we had a uniform carbon price, and from an economic point of view, for instance, it's very important that we have a uniform carbon price, that not everybody has a different carbon price. Of course, as you said, with all the other regulations we still have that, but the aim should be to have a uniform carbon price, and here we have an instrument which at least sort of lets us approach this sort of objective. And we have sort of managed to it was a long battle, but we have managed to improve it a lot. Initially we had a very lax cap, we increased the cap, and now we increased a little bit more. Maybe we should react faster, and we should increase the cap even further. But I think there was sort of amazing changes. And as you said, in the beginning we didn't believe in this, that this comes together at all, and so it did. So I mean, I would just, I mean, that was more like a statement rather than a question. I mean, sorry about that. But as a reaction to that, sort of, wouldn't it undermine actually solving the problem we're trying to solve? At the expense of having maybe a beautiful policy.
No.
Okay.
That was easy. I suppose it's one of these situations where if you've got a horse and it pulls a cart, then the cart goes forward. If you've got a dead horse, then that cart's going nowhere. And the problem we've got right now for much of the existence of the emissions trading scheme, the horse has been limping and struggling to move forward. It just has been. There are lots of reasons for that, not least of which the architecture designed in the outset wasn't good for rainy weather. It was fair weather architecture, and unfortunately within a short order it began to rain and it didn't really stop. I could take this metaphor in different directions. Then we ended up waist deep in the water, and people were recognizing they were waist deep in the water but didn't want to soak up that water anytime soon. So you ended up with, again, lowest common denominator approach. If you have a flood in your basement, the first thing to try and do is dry it up. When do you want to dry it up? Probably today, not 2019, I would argue. And yet we were waiting happily till 2019 to try and address the flood in the basement, which we know is there, which we know is hampering the ETS, which we know is actually stopping the market functioning. And we didn't want to solve it today, or tomorrow, or this year, or indeed next year. We've put it off because that's how political decision making works at an EU level, when you're trying to accommodate people who don't want to have it at all, versus those who frankly should be going faster than the herd because they can, but are choosing to wait for the herd to catch up. The UK has been decarbonising using EU instruments, and it's done so very well, as have many other states in the EU, and some have not decarbonised one iota because we've set a burden share at a level at which they don't need to decarbonise. So again, if the heavy lifting is done by those who can carry the largest weight, that's fine, and the UK is one of them. But the point is, nothing will stop the UK decarbonising at that rate going forward, inside or outside the EU. The only difference will be the burden that falls upon those who are left behind inside the EU has to be more equitably shared, and they're going to work out how to raise their ambition. Because you can't therefore rely upon the UK to do the heavy lifting anymore. So places like Bulgaria can't have a 0% target anymore. You've got to decarbonise as well. And I think right now we're in danger of looking at the ETS and just being grateful that it isn't dead yet, like the horse. But it's limping along right now, and unless we can get the price to move in a serious direction, which we're not able to do, then I don't think we've got a system that works. We might wish it worked, we might like it to work, but it doesn't work. Now, the UK has a carbon tax. You could argue that does work. If you hypothecate the funds from the tax, you can use that to innovate if you choose to do so. Of course, member states, including the UK, use that as a general reserve, so you can do that too. We spent a long time waiting for the ETS to work at the European level, and have not therefore taken forward policies at a member state level, which member states could have done, but have chosen not to. They've waited for the ETS to be somehow deus et machina, resolved and sorted and great, and it's not. And it won't be anytime soon. Even the reforms we're at now do not hit the ambition we need to have, and I know that, and I'm the bloody author of some of them, and I know they won't hit that. So I know right now that in 2021, the things we're aiming for aren't good enough. But they're what I could get. They were what I was able to move forward. When you're trying to take a herd of cats can't be a herd of cats. What's the collective noun for cats? Whatever it is. A gathering of cats and trying to move them into one small way. That's what it was like. We were lucky to get what we got, and I was surprised by the end we made such progress. And yet it was universally condemned by everyone who knew that that was not good enough. That's how policy is made. It's not very nice.
Mirabelle, have you got a question?
Well, it's a bit in the line of what Ralf was saying. So what you're saying is that we're better off having a decarbonized UK with the best technologies, but leaving other countries in Eastern Europe staying at a zero decarbonization rate, which, as Ralf, I know this is redoing the same point, but how do you feel in the future if we are outside the ETS in one of your options 2, 3, or 4? How do you feel, what would be the best way for the UK to keep engagement with Europe and with the countries that are moving more slowly to ensure that we reach targets towards the Paris Agreement?
Well, there are different ways to look at that. You could set up an ETS system outside. You could still, as part of your global commitment to climate change, still fund, if you were minded to, as you would seek to fund through various other mechanisms the rest of the globe through mitigation measures. If you're minded to do that, you can certainly still do that. Nothing stops you doing it. You just don't do it through the mechanism of the emissions trading scheme. If you wanted to do it, why not just do it in a different way? Why not just give them what they want, which is the money? They'd much rather have the money to decarbonise than they would have all the conditions set, as far as I can work out. Because the conditions are the very thing they don't want. They want freedom to do it as they want to do it, thereby creating for you a difficulty to construct an acceptable mechanism for them to do it. If you want them to decarbonise, give them money to decarbonise. That's fine. If you want to do that, Britain can do that. Or it could choose to look elsewhere and say, where are the biggest challenges right now on the face of the planet in terms of climate change? And focus the money there. Is it Europe? Probably not. Probably elsewhere. You might want to focus elsewhere, potentially. But going forward, and this is where I come back to, we now have a system which broadly protects certain states in the East from actually decarbonising. That doesn't make any sense. Now, I know they're at a different stage of their development, but actually, if the people creating much of the emissions actually are being told you don't need to decarbonise because you're further behind on the curve, that doesn't really make any sense to me. Everyone should therefore be looking at where the greatest difference can be made by the funds which can be applied. So the emissions trading scheme and the burden share that sits alongside it can be a challenge for us going forward. But right now, I think we end up atrophying the scenario whereby we keep certain people at the level at which they're emitting now, rather than encouraging the big change which we need. And even looking at something like the modernisation fund, which I think is, I don't know, a small inch away from being a bribe, really. That's what it is, to try and keep them happy enough with the system. Well, if you want to bribe them, just bribe them with money. Why bribe them with a mechanism? Just give them the cash. That's what they want. Why create the illusion it's somehow other part of a grand scheme? It isn't. It's a bribe to help them to modernise.
Okay, great. And then Baran, last question for the panel.
Yeah, that's very interesting, the insider's view of how sausage is made and what it tastes like at the end. I did have a question about how ETS, EU ETS, may have acted as, for UK politicians and policymakers, as a bit of an external anchor to get things done domestically, and wondered if and when we sever our ties, under the resulting system that replaces it, whether it will be more or less ambitious, and how it can be ensured, because we may end up in exactly the same situation domestically, where ambition is lowered compared to what has been the case in the EU mechanism.
Or it could be raised, because as I said before, if the Council have still yet to embrace the Paris ambitions, it's a reminder that collectively they don't want to. If they were wanting to send a message, January the 1st after Paris, they could have convened a special emergency council meeting to re-examine the council conclusions which they were using by which to measure their climate ambition, and could have adopted new ones. That would have sent a big message, but they didn't. We're still relying upon targets that were set, or ambitions that were set several years ago, and Paris has happened in between. And nobody has noticed or said we must do something now about that. I sat through Commission President Juncker's State of the Union address, where, again, just before Paris, I think it was, he spoke at length about a great number of things, spoke way too long, ran over by about 40 minutes, and eventually said at one point, actually, I haven't got time to speak about climate change. I wanted to. didn't have any time. I'll send you all a memo about climate change. I thought, well, that's not saying a lot about ambition there, President Juncker. Worst bit, didn't send the memo. Didn't send the memo. So you're left thinking, you are the President of the Commission. This is the single biggest issue affecting not only our continent but our globe, and you're going to send us a memo, oh, and you forgot. How does that rank in the grand scheme of things? The problem we have right now is that the EU is an amazing institution. It tries to do so many different things. Its challenge is, of course, you can't keep all the balls in the air at the same time. And while I would say that Cañete is an extraordinarily able man, far more than I suspect many people anticipated, I would say that Vice President Šefčovič is a waste of skin. He's responsible for energy union. His job is to put all these policies together. I've heard him give the same speech over and over and over again. What's that man for? And yet, he's the Vice President responsible for energy union. One speech, over and over again. I stopped going to it now. I could join in. I could sing the chorus of that man's speech.
May I get a quick response?
Yeah,
to that?
yeah, go ahead.
So I wonder if in a post-Brexit world, whether the UK politicians and policymakers will be running after some other things and perhaps put the climate agenda on the back burner.
It's a risk. Yep, I'm not going to deny that. For all we talk about climate change in every possible chancellerie or government office, how quickly it can seem to be set aside when other things come along. And I think that's where the EU can be useful, because its retarding force in terms of changing things quickly also retards the inability to set things aside quickly either. So you're literally anchored by their inability to move forward fast. So you are held back and also, therefore, kept in the same position. So actually, in that sense, the EU can be quite helpful. Doesn't sound like a good thing, but it's true.
Okay, great. I'm going to open it to questions from the floor. Some eager hands came up for us. So first of all, you right there in front of me. You were first.
Hi, I'm Sophie Robinson, a journalist at Responsible Investor. We talked a lot, for obvious reasons, about the sort of political element of the EU ETS, but I write for institutional investors who are quite interested in this. What's the role of the private sector? Is there anything that institutional investors can do to move the EU ETS? I'm not talking about Brexit, I'm talking about the general architecture and progress being made.
The problem we've had with much of the lobbying. My predecessor who did the Phase 3 reform spoke about the number of lobbyists who came through her office and the sheer range of lobbyists. And when I submitted my declaration of who'd been to lobby me, there were very few names on it, but people were therefore thinking I had secret meetings. I've tried not to meet anybody now. I'm happy to receive written responses. I want written information. I don't want to sit with someone who's going to try and browbeat me into these issues at all. The private sector has often struggled because for every person arguing that they should go left, another person's arguing they should go right. And you end up with you can't please all of the people all of the time. But I'll tell you one thing, you can piss them all off at the same time. I seem to have managed that more often than not. So the challenge I have, I think, when it comes to the institutional question, the notion of investment, is what you want is sound architecture that you don't change again. You want sound, serious architecture, and you want it thudding in, and it's built and it's constructed. What you do with the garden and the lawn and the driveway, fine, but the architecture has to be agreed. We might be there this time, but we haven't been there for a while. That's been the problem, because we're literally playing with the architecture. If we can get to the stage now where the architecture works, then the question of cement shouldn't be an issue, because the architecture should be such that we see the problem, remedy the problem, and therefore get ahead of it. So the architecture, hopefully, that will emerge out of this discussion should be the house that we want to live in, and a house in which we can work in that will function. It should be that. Maybe. I'm listening to council tugging in different directions about two things for them. Of course, it's share, auction share, back to the money question. That's the big issue for member states. And carbon leakage, which is about jobs going east usually, or south. Those are the two big issues for politicians that have to get re-elected. I'm not one of those, I hasten to, and I'm not looking to get re-elected. But for others, for member states, for governments in office, jobs matter and cash revenue matters. So they're looking to keep those things. And I want to play with that money for different purposes. So I've tried to adjust it. But my ability to adjust was quite limited because member states, if I was too radical, I know member states would therefore cut me off at the knees. And what we propose as a parliament wouldn't go anywhere. So it's not a good answer, actually. But at the same time, it is, if we get the architecture right, and I think everyone now recognises that it wasn't right before, and this is our chance. maybe.
Okay, there are lots of questions and I think you're limited for time, so I'm gonna take 3 questions and then you can gather answers on all of them, and then again, so first of all, over there in the suit.
Yeah, Tom Pike, Imperial College. I appreciate your candor with the EU ETS, how it's been working and not working, but I'd like to address what you're proposing in terms of a UK possible alternative here. And maybe one big test to see how that might work is what is on the table right at the moment, which is the expansion of aviation. And this is actually not an area where the UK at the moment seems to be covering itself in glory in terms of the Airport Commission, well, at one point saying, well, we're going to use EU ETS to take the emissions out, has not then put no carbon costing in at all. So it's kind of hiding behind ETS without taking responsibility for the carbon emissions that may take place. This was the first issue, the first big development that was announced after Brexit, and this is not necessarily a very good sign that leadership will actually occur in the UK, but maybe what you were suggesting, that it will be pushed to one side, and what we will see is carbon emissions, rather than being pushed down, maybe by an element of lethargy, in fact being allowed to leap ahead, which is exactly what the DFT is saying at the moment. And I appreciate your thoughts as to whether that can be seriously tackled and considered, because it isn't so far, especially given we will be loosened by our existing obligations under EU ETS, not that those are being put into play either.
Okay, great. Question aviation, and I'm gonna take 2 more questions. I think you were the second. Yeah. Good. In the front row. Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned about this architecture of all Europe, etc. You don't think that in order that this architecture will be real and effective, and we have an innovative policy, you need a policy from bottom up, not a policy from top down. You need a policy more related with decentralization. You can have a strategy even at national level, and therefore integrate from bottom up. But before you build this architecture, you need to know the process. How you know the process? This is my question. How you integrated the policy with, let's say, the link between implementation and strategy, if this architecture is not well built from bottom up?
Okay, great. And a 3rd question from there. Maria.
So my question is basically, we did a piece of analysis that looked at, for 2030, if the UK were to leave, the EU would have to decarbonize 138 million tons more CO2. What are the chances that this would be a good way for the EU ETS to say, all right, instead of recalculating our targets without the UK, we just reserve 138 million tons in the market reserve mechanism? It's a good way of soaking up the excess. It's a drop in the ocean, but it's a way.
Sorry, yeah.
Okay, great. So take those 3 questions.
I can. Aviation, I think it will come out of the ETS. I don't think that will fit in there comfortably. It doesn't fit there comfortably at the moment, nor does maritime. These are areas that need to be addressed, but I don't think the mechanism of the ETS is it, personally. I think there are UN agencies, ICOA, IMO, that should be looking at these, at global standards. I think these 2 areas are so mobile by their nature, their transport. I am not yet convinced that we've got a way of accommodating it comfortably in there that doesn't disadvantage the EU vis-a-vis the rest of the globe. I think that's absolutely true, and I think we are guilty at a global level of not trying to address these issues. That would be my take on that. So you're right, however, that the question is what will the UK do about that? I think the UK is probably wondering what the rest of the EU will do about it, because the EU is not in any way unified in a position. I'm struck. I didn't anticipate these 2 things surviving through into the plenary position of the Parliament, but it did. But I know that they will struggle to pass through the Council, because the Council don't want these elements there at all. Or certain member states don't, so they'll get tugged out, or watered down, or removed in some fashion. Bottom up, I love bottom up, that's absolutely right. Spot on, it should be bottom up. The EU's not great at bottom up, though.
Yes, but there is knowledge. There is no
I know.
knowledge.
I don't have to tell me, I'm fully aware of the knowledge. In fact, I would argue now, most of the industries that we're talking about are driving the change themselves, not because they are aspiring to a strategy, but because they're looking at the bottom line and working how to basically make themselves more efficient, save money, make a profit, and do that. That ability is done at the bottom level, at the company level.
It's not the issue. The technologies means the industry. For example, we have a project now, right now, how you can decarbonize the industry in any sector. We are using data, and these are missing. This means we don't have enough data in order that you can reach this policy here.
I agree with that. Missing data is a huge problem. But when we raise that with the Commission, they tell us they haven't got the capacity to gather the data. So you're left with this issue of...
I even arguing now, there is capacity.
But the
Now,
problem...
Okay, I think we need to land down the questions. There are a few more people who want to try to get questions.
The problem I have with this all the time is, if you were making law in a sensible world, you would do a serious impact assessment at the outset and establish that. And we never really do that. The impact assessments are always loaded impact assessments. There's always the magician's deck of cards with one card that you're really more likely to take because that's the preferred option. And I think time and time again, for all we talk about the EU being a huge overarching bureaucracy, it's usually understaffed in the very areas you want people in and overstaffed in the very areas you don't want them in. But that's for another post-Brexit world, I imagine. The decarbonising question is an interesting one. Cancellation is something I think we should be doing now, and I've been an advocate of cancellation, voluntary cancellation. Voluntary cancellation is like cancelling money. And so member states don't like to cancel money. And so the problem that I have when I've been talking about cancellation, I'm talking about billions of pounds suddenly. Not intentionally, I wasn't thinking about it in terms of money at the outset, but it's billions of pounds that I'm asking the governments of the different states of just to give up. Most of them don't want to give it up. And I think the difficulty I've had with the voluntary approach, because I was arguing, if you really are going to talk the talk, you've got to walk the walk. If you're going to declare that Paris is so important, then of course you should voluntarily accept that, retiring the allowances or somehow or other cancelling them should be a natural thing to do. But by goodness, talk to member states about that and you'll discover they're not keen. They are really not keen, which is why when you look at the council position about how to look at the market stability reserve, cancellation is conditional. Cancellation is not up front, and the Parliament is up front. We want 800 million cancelled up front. Council has a higher ambition, but it's conditional upon other things. And I have little doubt that those conditions won't always be met and the cancellation won't always be quite what you'd expect it to be. So the challenge, therefore, is how do you accommodate, to my mind, upfront cancellation with a serious conditional cancellation, which is real. You will be meeting the conditions and you will cancel, and that will be the outcome. Because a condition that you can never meet will lead to no cancellation at all. And therein, it's a fake point. But again, the architecture is there now, I think. It's on our side of the pitch. I would hope we can make serious progress on that.
Great. Can I allow a few more questions?
Yes, why not?
Okay. Last couple of questions. Over there. Yeah.
Hi, Ben. I'm a journalist from a news service called Carbon Force. Given your position about the UK is better off kind of going it alone, do you also think that's inevitable that should it do that, then it means lowering its ambitions in terms of its Climate Change Act, which it can currently use the ETS now to technically can buy a bullet of cheap emissions reductions from Bulgaria and Romania. If it goes it alone, it's stuck with the expenses.
Let me answer that just right away. I don't think the UK is better going it alone, except when it comes to reform. Because my issue right now as I consider this is we literally are struggling to reform, even when everyone agrees that reform is required, even when everyone has agreed on the ambition that the reform must be within. Everyone has agreed on it, we still can't reform it. This is my fear now, is that at an EU level you end up retarding your ability to realise the ambition. At a member state level, now this is correct, you're absolutely spot on. What happens then if the ambition is set by a government that's not ambitious? Then how do you solve that problem? Because the difficulty you face is, it's fine to talk about the ease with which the mechanism can be constructed at the member state level if the member state is ambitious to do it. If it's not ambitious, then you've got a problem. This comes back to the point we were touching upon earlier, which is at an EU level, you have to be part of the EU gang, and therefore you can't simply let your ambition drop below, even although the ambition may not be as high as it could be. So I would argue right now, it's the mechanism of reform. If you could get the architecture right, the UK should stay in if we can get it right. The problem I'm fearful of is that we're going to end up tinkering again with this because we haven't got the architecture right, and we're going to revisit it in real time. And if we're talking about what industry wants, which I think is probably a horizon they can see and something they can plan toward, the very notion we're going to tinker and tinker and change year after year after year. I mean, we'll have been moving the goalposts on the ETS now almost every few months for the last 3 years, with the prospect of the next 3 years thereafter being the same thing again. If I was a business or an industry, I'd be struggling to know what to do next. Which is why, oddly enough, I've been very keen to try and take some of the small emitters out of the ETS entirely. because they're the ones that are least able to cope with these sorts of changes, these sorts of changing goalposts. Now, not to take them out of the ambition to address carbon, to address emissions, but rather bring them into national remit, rather than having to depend upon a pan-European happy-go-lucky flying circus that might or might not help them in the future.
Great. Couple more. There was one over there and then one in the middle. So go ahead.
I strangely find myself agreeing with much of what you said.
That's how good I can be, my word!
Happy to hear, yes. However, you've mentioned the word architecture very often, and I think you've hit it bang on the nail. The architecture is totally flawed because it's based on a fixed point of 2010, and it's based on fixed decrease rates
Yes?
that have no bearing on what's actually happening on the ground, which is exactly the point you've made. So surely the thing we need to do to change the architecture is to have an architecture that's attenuated to real life changes, and that has never been sufficiently on the table in this reform, and we will never have a decent reform until we start tackling that attenuation to the real situation.
Should we just take the last question?
Yes, of course, sorry, yeah, sorry.
Ultimately, it's an issue of global leadership. And do you think that the entry of China in, or the introduction of a market system in China, and with the fact that Europe has always boasted of being a global leader in this sector, could sort of push the EU to be more ambitious,
Yeah.
or let's say paradoxically, since the government now wants to join other companies, other sort of linkage of UK ETS with the Chinese system.
Good question. Come back to that in a minute. I agree, but I haven't got the votes for that. I couldn't do that. There were no votes. The issue I think that people struggle with is the belief that because it is right, it therefore must be able to gather together the correct number of votes to make it happen. It isn't like that. I knew from early discussions we've had them, I didn't have the votes for that. I couldn't get that at all moving in the direction you wanted. And I knew how far off I was, and when I was telling you the tale earlier about the right and the left not doing their head count correctly, I've done my head count. I knew what we could get through. Now, I was fooled at the end also by the bluff, which didn't work, by the what's called the progressive left, who thought they had the votes to do exactly as you described, but didn't. And the dilemma, therefore, was that in believing they had the votes to do it, they sacrificed other things which would have been a higher ambition on the table in order to deliver something they didn't have the votes to deliver. And that was daft as a matter of
What do you feel they sacrificed? What did they
the
sacrifice?
2.4. 2.4 was on the table.
2.4 would have achieved virtually nothing.
No, but I know that, but 2.4 was a big issue for that very group, who then said, no, we're willing to have just 2.2. And that's what they got, 2.2. 2.4 I was being shouted at when I first published my proposals that I was a climate action criminal for not having 2.4 in that particular approach. Now, I agree, I know that that is a token issue, I'm aware of that, but that was on the table amongst other things. And they were all turned down because they believed they had the votes, and they were wrong. And the whole point about doing a head count is you've got to count the right number of heads. It's like counting sheep's legs and dividing by 4. You need to have some way of making sure you've got the count correct, because there could be a 3-legged sheep in there somewhere, and they had quite a lot of no-legged sheep in there that they were counting, as far as I could work out. The China question, however, is absolutely fascinating. When you think about when we began to recognise that things were changing fast, it was the US-China deal that preceded and prefaced where the globe at that point, we're not there now anymore, where the globe at that point was going. China, it can achieve things by fiat. They can fill a valley with water if they want and move all the people out, and they can do that because they are a dictatorship. They're able to function at that level. I have a suspicion that much of the change we're going to witness for the next couple of years will be driven by China. The US is probably shuffling off the old climate change pitch as we speak, only surmising from the discussions I've had with some Americans. The EU has become a bit more navel-gazery in the last little while for Brexit reasons, but other reasons as well. They're not the progressive driver of climate change initiatives that they could and should be and were once, but I don't think they are right now. I think they are not there. And I think the people who are pushing hardest and strongest all the way along are the Chinese, not often for climate change issues, often because of emissions more generally, pollution, That's one of the bigger drivers of decarbonising in China, I would argue, rather than just trying to achieve the broader CO2 issue. But I do think in the years to come, we need to work very closely with China. And in an ideal world, I'd have been talking about linking the EU scheme with the Chinese scheme. But the minute I say that out loud, I know that to try and do that, to create the mechanism to do that, would require another reform of the EU ETS, which would just be another horror story of trying to make that so. When I started this project, when I confessed to you at the beginning I didn't think it would work, there were two things I wanted to do. One was to work out how to connect into the other schemes globally, and the other issue was to look at process emissions, which I didn't believe were being treated correctly, because there are certain processes that create emissions, and you can't reduce emissions because that would just stop the process. I wanted to address those two things head on, and I failed entirely to address either of them. And they were the only two things I wanted to address, because I've discovered that actually making sausages is actually a lot less fun than it looks from the distance. And that's my world now. I mean, I would never look at another sausage again, frankly, after this particular adventure. But China, I think right now, has a much more direct way of determining its ambition and its policy. They're just doing it for reasons we can't always understand. And I think we see a financial advantage tucked inside it somewhere. So again, a lot of the technologies that we are going to have to embrace should be coming from the EU, but they're not. They're mostly coming from somewhere else. And a lot of that will be China. And they see an economic advantage. And I'm not sure that the EU has figured out that it needs to innovate better, and it's not innovating at all well. And the Innovation Fund isn't, I think, enough to do that. There has to be some way of freeing up the technology innovators that we've not yet managed to do at an EU level. We're not good at innovating. The US, good. China, by other means, good. EU, poor at innovation, which is a shame.
Great. Well, thank you so very, very much for giving us your time. Really appreciate it. And for staying a few minutes later to answer some more questions. Unfortunately, you'll miss the interesting talks that we have from the other panelists.
But you'll be videoing this, I imagine.
But you'll be able to click and follow it on. Exactly. We'll ask questions to the camera.
Now, don't tell anyone what I said, because I'll get into terrible trouble for this.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you. Okay, if you can remain in your seats. We have the next speaker, which we're going to ask Ralf, I think, is going to speak a little bit about...
Should I speak there?
Yeah, you can speak up there. About the effectiveness of the EU ETS so far.
I think I'm going to move temporarily.
You're going to move?
Yeah.
See. No? Okay, hello again. So actually, I mean, this event was sort of convened to mark the launch of a paper by Mirabelle and myself and a number of other co-authors, where we sort of reviewed the evidence on what the EU ETS has actually done. And most importantly, not sort of, we didn't model. There's a lot of stuff there where people sort of have fancy models and think about what happens in sort of 50 years or 100 years. That's not what we did. We just looked at the ex post evidence. And I don't want to give you a full presentation of that because otherwise you wouldn't read the paper or the discussion paper. I just want to give you the upshot. And this is the motivation, which we all know by now. The ETS has been around for a while now, and it's by many considered the biggest experiment in emissions trading, both because it's of its ambition of being across multiple countries. That is unique. There has been a lot of emissions trading before, especially in the US, but trading something like that across multiple countries is sort of a new thing. But also that you're not only covering a small sector of the economy, a couple of coal-fired power stations or something like that. You're really covering vast swathes of the economy where you have manufacturing plants, small and large power stations, and now, of course, in the latest phase, as we've heard already, aviation. So this is a special thing, and we should sort of look at that. Summarizing this whole stuff, I was wondering at some point if people think about Schrödinger's ETS. What do I mean by that? It's a bit like Schrödinger's immigrant, that sort of the ETS is being blamed simultaneously for two things which are a bit mutually exclusive, right? So on the one hand, people blame it for being not good enough, not achieving anything, on the, it's useless. There is no price. It doesn't change behavior or emissions. On the other hand, people say, well, it's way too effective. It causes carbon leakage. It ruins the competitiveness. And of course, that can only happen if it's actually doing something. But this might be an interesting philosophical debate. But actually, we don't have to stay there. We can look at the evidence. And let's look first at the price. That is the ETS price, the spot price, all through the whole ETS period, or not entirely. Actually, where's the Sandbag? I stole that from Sandbag because I only had the graph until 2015, and you had the last couple of years. So of course, we know there had been these sort of dramatic drops in the price after in various cases. Firstly, we had the sort of phase 1 episode where things broke down once we sort of had a bit more data coming in, and we realized that actually the caps are way too generous. And of course, then also we didn't have banking in phase 1. That's why it really went down to 0 in the end, the spot price for phase 1 permits. But then we started on with phase 2, and things were much better. The design was better. The architecture was better in the sense that there was a sort of long-term cap, which was sort of defined into the future, and it was sort of set at the EU level. But then, of course, basically the economic crisis happened, which nobody foresaw in this context, and that sort of led to another price drop. Having said that, I think my takeaway from that is, the price was constantly lower than we thought it should be, right? So if you look at the sort of impact assessments we heard already about, it's always 30 euros per ton of carbon. So it's never really been 30 euros per ton of carbon, but it's not a negligible price, especially if you compare it to what is typically carbon pricing. I mean, if you have, for instance, a CCL in the UK, that is maybe a bit around 10 to 15 pounds per ton of carbon, right? And there are a lot of exemptions as well. Most people don't pay actually that full rate of 10 to 15 pounds per ton of carbon. That's for gas. Also, the rate varies between different fuels. So here we have something which, well, it's been collapsed, in 2016 to 3 euros, but I checked yesterday, it was back to 5, right? So it had some problems. It was lower than expected, but it was not negligible. I think that is the message I take away from that. But of course, we're not terribly interested in the carbon price as such. We're having this stuff because we want to look at, we are interested in other outcomes. Foremost, we want to know, is there an effect on emissions? I mean, that is the whole point why it's there. But then, of course, there's the worry, as we already have heard. People are worried about jobs. Does this sort of just, is this an extra cost for the business sector, which leaves us worse off, and in the worst case, just causes carbon leakage. But also, I mean, if you go back to the original documents, it was not only about emissions. It was also supposed to be an instrument that sort of facilitates or promotes innovation in the clean area. Actually, I totally didn't agree with this last statement. And if you look at where our carbon innovations are, there's a lot of that in Europe, actually. Anyways, so these are the three things. And well, what can we say about this? Well, there is a sort of, the literature could be larger, but we basically looked at, we started from around, initially we had a couple of 300 or so papers. We sort of reduced that down to about 56 papers that actually had something to say about ex post, which were not just predictions, modeling, or some kind of just some surveys. And on the basis of that, I don't give you all the details, but basically along these 3 dimensions, on emissions, competitiveness, and clean innovation, what is the upshot? Emissions, yes, there has been an impact, and in some industries it has been up to 15 to 20%. You see the graph up there. That graph basically shows you whether there has been an impact of the ETS in a piece of research that we actually did with Mirabelle. And what you see there initially, the impact is the line is around 0, which means there was no impact, and that is a good thing because we are the ETS hasn't happened yet in the 90s. But then once you get into it has been announced in 2001. Once you get into the announcement phase, that is the first sort of bar you see there, and then the sort of first trading phase, you see something is happening, but the whole thing becomes sort of clear and significant only in the last, that's the last trading phase where we had data, the phase 2. There you see a strong impact on emissions. That is, I should say, for French manufacturing in this case, we find that. And of course, it's not sort of the same thing in all sectors. Other people have found smaller reductions using different methods in other sectors. But people have found reductions. There was clearly, it's not like we had this thing and it was just a sort of something which kept politicians and traders and analysts busy. It actually has changed something on the ground in terms of emissions. Competitiveness, well, so far there is no evidence that it had any massive effect on competitiveness. I mean, we haven't found any paper that found sort of any kind of clear effect. What about innovation? Again, a graph here from some friends of ours at LSE who did this study on and this is clean innovations measured through patent statistics, and they again detected a sort of small but significant effect sort of in phase 2. I mean, this last bit you see there, that is actually significant. So that is what sort of evidence says. So what does this mean for Schrödinger's cat? Well, I would say the ETS is, I absolutely don't share the skepticism of our previous speaker. I think it's doing something, and of course that doesn't mean it couldn't do it better, right? And it's clear that we have a problem at the moment with the low price and the sort of glut until 2020 and maybe until 2030. And so something should be done. Something is being done, and I mean, I think what also has to be kept in mind, at least as far as I understand it, maybe you know better about this, but we have a cap that is going until 2050 at the moment. And if you sort of if you calculate what the implications are, we should have a reduction of 70 to 80% of the emissions by 2050. Yeah, and if you think we have an 80% reduction, maybe we want to have a 90% reduction, that is fine. But if you have an 80% reduction written in law already, so that is a pretty good thing, and we shouldn't diss that, right? So I mean, and in that sense, I think the question is not so much, what is there a glut at the moment? Of course, we had the crisis, but why is the price so low? Actually, we should see that people now, we should all run out there and buy emissions permits, because we think if you have an 80% reduction in 2050, it should be worth a lot, And at the moment, I mean, you might have to make some assumptions here, but I made a sort of somewhat conservative calculation. You think if you have now 5 euros, then what we think about the price in 2000, if you want to have a trade between this and no arbitrage, then we think in 2050 we should have a price of 25 euro. So do we think a price of 25 euro is realistic if we really have a sort of 80% reduction of half of Europe's emissions? I would think it's not realistic. So I think that the problem we're having is not so much that that the cap could be a bit lower. Maybe we can debate about that. But the problem is that we have a sort of lack of confidence. I think traders or people who operate in the market don't believe that maybe in 2050 the ETS is still around. I think that's what is sort of reflected in that. And so I think one of the things we have to ensure is that we can increase the trust. And I mean, I'm not entirely sure how we can do this, but sort of one thing which not only me, but other people have proposed at some point is maybe we should have a floor price rather than sort of, and that might sort of play into what Ian Duncan has been talking about. We need a sort of more agile architecture, right? Where we sort of don't need such a long and convoluted process to make small adjustments. Rather, we have sort of a fairly sort of quick mechanism where we say, okay, this is what we accept at the floor price, and let's then sort of react quickly. Anyways, we can debate about this. What about the ETS and Brexit? Does Brexit mean necessarily EU ETS Sexit? Well, I would say, like everything else, Brexit, this is a stupid idea. Here are some reasons. That is a sort of qualified expert opinion, of course. You have something that works, why destroy it? It will be more red tape. You need more. You will have. If you start now again, you will have again the same lobbying. I mean, and the same sort of political fights you have now. You will have them again. And you will have more policy uncertainty. We know a lot about. This is about long-term investments. I mean, he was talking about moving the goalpost, but I don't think. Of course, we shouldn't move the goalpost, but he's proposing to sort of tear up the pitch. I mean, that is sort of worse than moving the goalpost, I would say, in terms of uncertainty. You lose long-term credibility if you say, well, let's not walk away and do something else. And I don't see that there is something we can readily go to, and then we will be just as well off as we are before, or even better, as he suggests. The thing is also, climate policy should ideally be global. We know, if we just decarbonize the UK, it won't make a dent on climate change. So we need to have a global solution. So the next best thing is we have at the moment, unfortunately, is the EU, which can have a credible price and a credible policy at the European level. So we should not just throw this out. And also, I think we have some research coming up which shows that so far we didn't have competitiveness effects, primarily because the prices were not too high. And at some point there comes the point if you had a price of, I don't know, 500 euro per ton of carbon, I'm sure you had some competitiveness effects. The more you compartmentalize these things, the worse this becomes. And we have some results which show that if you compare the sort of potential risk to competitiveness between Europe and the rest of the world and within Europe, if you have variations in carbon price within Europe, the risk to competitiveness, the chance that something bad goes on with the competitiveness is 80% higher than if you have a sort of common European solution. So, I think, of course, some Brexiteers might say, well, we're going to have the sort of deregulated sort of low tax economy in the UK, and that sort of includes, we don't believe in climate change, and of course we don't do all this green crap or whatever their sort of slogan is. I don't think that is a sort of a good approach for addressing climate change. That's what I wanted to say. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Okay, we'll take questions at the end of all three speakers. So Baran, if you want to come up.
I'll be using slides as well, so step over here. Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity. This is, as you can see, a topic that is very important, current, and people can speak very passionately about the different things that come up in the context. Today we're talking about what is a decade of EU ETS delivered. I think Ian's speech and Ralf's presentation gave us a good idea of how this came about. And what I would like to do is to extend some of Ralf's talk on Brexit, talk about some of the options that UK has following Brexit negotiations and when the day comes that the country is out of the European Union. Most of what I'm going to tell you about today is based on recent and ongoing research. I will give you some links at the very end so you can go and read about them if you wish to find out more. So, 3 very highly stylized options is what I'm going to talk about. Option 1, by the way, before, I had no idea what Ian was going to speak about, and he has already picked up most of the options that I will tell you a bit more about. In particular, I will highlight some of the costs and benefits that are important in this context. So, what's option 1? Option 1 is maintain UK's participation in the EU ETS. We've just heard that EU ETS has been criticized a lot, but at the same time it has achieved things. In particular, it's a cost-effective market mechanism that allowed a uniform price to coordinate the actions of very diverse emitters all around the continent and in the UK to coordinate their actions. This is important. Ralf has told us that it has delivered emissions reductions, it has increased green innovation, and at the same time, it's had very little undesirable side effects on economic performance. These are all very important things, and UK has benefited from this. In fact, our research has shown that as a relatively small member of the carbon market EU ETS, UK has benefited relatively more from this market. Now, the UK can continue with this option, therefore have additional benefits in the future, But this comes at the cost of less control of the country's own climate change policies, and obviously having left the EU, less control over how EU takes the emissions trading system forward, less input into the reform process. It may also be subject to the European Court of Justice, these are things that are politically quite unpalatable in today's terms. What other option there might be? Option 2 might be to institute UK ETS, and there's an end, because you can do many things after you institute the UK ETS. One of those things is to go it alone. When you do this, you're going to have complete control over UK policy. You can set the cap, you can institute a price collar, price floor, as one currently exists, and raise or lower the ambition as you see fit. However, this would be a very small market. And it's well known that the larger the market, the bigger potential for gains from trade, and bigger potential for cost savings, and the UK would be foregoing this. So UK ETS would be too small. By the way, this would not be the first time the UK runs an ETS. Prior to phase 1, the UK had its own ETS, however small it was, and I believe the benefits that it's gained are much smaller compared to its participation in the EU ETS.
It's way worse than the EU ETS.
Right?
The price was always zero. So.
Yeah. Now, what you would also have is this, this is a point that Ralf mentioned. You would have foregone gains from trade in the sense that if the European price is different than the UK price, both the buyers of the permits and the sellers of the permits would have an incentive to undertake the transaction. And in fact, if you don't undertake this transaction, then there are some efficiency losses. These would be lost. That's one option, go it alone, option 2.1. Option 2.2 would be have your ETS and then look forward to linking with other emissions trading systems that exist around the world. We don't quite yet have an ETS, a national ETS in China, but we're expected to have one this year. So UK could look east and link to China, or look west and link to some of the existing systems in North America. One I would like to highlight is the Western Climate Initiative. This is a currently operating system between the province of Quebec and the state of California in the US. We could consider linking those. This way, you would not have as much control over own policy, because whatever happens in the markets that are that you're linked to will have an impact on what happens in the UK. But you would get the benefits of linking. The things that the foregone gains from trade perhaps will be different. Less. Now the issue is with China, very big market, even bigger than the EU ETS expected. We would benefit quite a bit more compared to the current situation. But that's not taking into account the costs that will be forthcoming in negotiating, in setting up this linking arrangement with China. At the same time, China has no track records, institutionally, culturally, commercially, very different from the EU. So those costs will be a lot higher compared to the costs that UK has already incurred in being part of the EU ETS. What about Western Climate Initiative? Now, we have two subnational actors, Province of Ontario in Canada and the State of California in the US. Province of Quebec in Canada and State of California in the US. Ontario is thinking about joining this. So we have three subnational actors that you're negotiating a carbon deal with. At the same time, you're negotiating with the federal governments there a trade deal in the aftermath of Brexit. These costs can quickly mount up and eat into the gains that you may have from the emissions trading system being linked to these other markets. Finally, this is, if I understood it correctly, Ian's favorite option. Leave the EU ETS, set up UK ETS, and link back into it. It seems like a rather roundabout way of remaining in the EU ETS and perhaps maintaining some influence over some of the policy decisions that are going on at the European level. You would also forego some of the benefits, because this will take time to renegotiate this link. although it may be politically more palatable because you may perhaps go out of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Now, a final option is for the UK to institute a carbon tax. There is already, in a way, a carbon tax in the UK. This would give complete control over UK policy to UK decision makers and policymakers. It would raise revenues, which you can then use for other purposes. In fact, it would be my preferred option, provided that it is comprehensive and it is at a sufficiently high level. In fact, I would even recommend that the EU and everywhere where there's a carbon market, we could dispense with it and replace it with a harmonized global carbon tax. However, this is politically very difficult, and those difficulties which prevented it from appearing in the first place will probably prevent it from being a meaningful UK carbon tax that's comprehensive and sufficiently high. We will probably not get there. So in the light of these political realities, and on balance of all the costs and benefits that one may consider looking at these three options, my recommendation for the UK government would be to aim for remaining in the EU ETS and contribute to the reform efforts that are ongoing. At the very beginning, I mentioned that there are two papers that lie behind this. If you would like to email me, I can send you the direct links, but those are the papers. One is a non-technical paper that looks at these options that I've just talked about, and the other one is an academic paper whose results motivate some of the things that I've told you today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Great. What we will do anyway after this event is we're going to circulate the link to the video, and we can include the links to your papers there as well.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Thanks.
Okay. I'd like to ask Adam to give us some thoughts as well before we open up for questions.
Okay, I'll try and keep this relatively brief because I'm last and I'm sure everybody's got loads of questions. I'm going to talk about the implications of the UK leaving the EU ETS. Which seems to me the most likely option. I'm not taking any view there on whether it's the most desirable, but it seems to me overwhelmingly the most likely given what we know about the context of Brexit. So a few implications of that. The first I raised with Ian Duncan is the increase in the surplus effectively. It's a larger proportion of the market unless some of that surplus is cancelled, which seems unlikely. This means that the reform of the MSR, which cancels allowances from the MSR above a certain size limit, is all the more important. I would certainly hope Ian is able to do what he seems to be suggesting, which is to support that, and I hope that survives the trialogue process. There's a secondary question, by the way, about what happens to allowances originating from the UK in the MSR and whether they're cancelled. But the size limit on the MSR is by far the more important. All the more important, it's necessary anyway, but it's all the more important with the UK outside the EU ETS. From a UK perspective, one of the things that seems certain to need to happen to me is a change in the accounting for the traded sectors under the Climate Change Act. So at the moment, essentially, the traded sector is regarded as whatever the allocation under the EU ETS is. Well, there isn't one of those anymore. You will need to specify on what basis climate change acts and carbon budgets are calculated. It seems to me natural that would be actual UK emissions, including from the power sector, which is not done at the present. However, there will be an issue with how you treat electricity interconnection, and that's an issue both sides of the interconnector for how they're treated in the UK and how they're treated in the remainder of the EU. That's more important because of the fairly large-scale increases in the electricity interconnection the UK is expecting, something like tripling over the next few years potentially. Obviously, you want to avoid either double counting or not counting emissions under that sort of regime. Third thing is, I think the question of border adjustments may raise its head. The extent to which that crops up, I think, depends rather on the more general sets of agreements on free trades and tariffs and so forth. But if you have a relatively high carbon price, as you do at the moment in the power sector in the UK, and a much lower carbon price as you do at the moment in the EU, there are potential distortions to trade, especially with an increase in interconnection. Would you think about putting some kind of border carbon tax or border carbon adjustment in those sorts of circumstances? I note that the WCI schemes, which were just mentioned, have exactly those sorts of provisions for the electricity sector. Similar provisions were considered for the EU ETS for cement, though they've fallen by the wayside. There are quite elaborate provisions in California and Quebec to prevent what's called resource shuffling, that is essentially moving emissions around and pretending to sell low carbon power when you're really not. But they're there and they're in place and actually rather necessary for the power sector. So that's a question. I'm not suggesting it's necessarily the way to go, but it's something that will, I think, be on the agenda. Fourth, I think there's a lot of opportunity for the UK to rethink its own policies. Absolutely hear what people have been saying about the potential for slipping backwards, but equally there's some opportunities to redefine how things are done, and that may lead to some creative options. I mean, if I were playing fantasy policy here, I would probably suggest that you think about something like the California solution, which is an ETS of much wider coverage, up to around 80–85%. It has a floor price, which is not as high as it should be, but it still gives you a price considerably higher than under the EU ETS. And lots of other policies in place to essentially drive the longer term transition, part to ensure the carbon price does not get too high. The California market, even if you include Quebec, though not Ontario, is actually smaller than the UK, so the UK would have a larger ETS if it were broadly drawn. There will be some question as to whether that would make linkage to the EU ETS more difficult if you had a more broadly drawn scheme, but that need not necessarily be a compelling objection, I don't think. It may also enable linkages to WCI if you wanted to go that route, though for me actually linkage will be less important than establishing that scheme in the first place. So that, I think, would be an interesting way to go, having something like the California system applying to the UK and essentially operationalising carbon budgets in the form of a broadly drawn emissions cap under an ETS. Fifth thing is, and this applies to both the UK and the EU, probably quite a lot of commercial contracts that are going to need to be revised and potentially rewritten. EUA prices are one way or another written into things like power sales contracts and so for hedging agreements, that sort of thing. Lots of work there for people in companies and for their lawyers, I would suggest. Finally, on the linkage issue, I don't want to go into that in detail, but I would just make one comment on timing, and also, afraid can't resist the temptation to disagree with some of what Ian said there. Firstly, the reason some of us were saying that the deal that came out of the Parliament was a really bad one was it was a terrible deal. And specifically, there were two things needed to make the EU ETS a more meaningful price signal. One, to fix the long term, was to limit the size of the MSR. Didn't happen in Parliament, has happened in Council. Hopefully we'll be able to retain that, but that only fixes the long term. It doesn't do anything about the fact that you've got a system which is weak in the short to medium term, by which I mean the next 10 years. To do that was, Tricia hinted with a question, is the rebasing option. Ian says it wasn't doable, you gave things up. The things you gave up, as Tricia quite rightly said, were absolutely trivial. You needed to do something much more drastic, and that simply wasn't done. So what came out of the Parliament didn't do either of the main things that you needed. Fortunately, we've got one of them from Council. But that still means we've got an EU ETS that's weak for probably 10 years. Why do I say that, or what's the evidence base for that? Firstly, is both current and forward prices are stuck at €5. That does lead to some cost-effective abatement, but really very little. Secondly, you've already got emissions. Emissions for last year, based on provisional data, were already below the first year of phase 4. They're already below 2021, 4 years away, and there's a downward trend in emissions. You're about 11% below the cap at the moment. That is not the basis on which to build a sound system. The final thing is, if you look at future emissions potentials, 40% of emissions under the EU ETS come from coal-fired power generation. Still huge opportunities for low-cost abatement. It's frankly completely inappropriate that a system designed to cost effectively reduce emissions is allowing so much coal generation to continue. Now, if you like, slight advantage is that it means that the UK will not be missing a whole lot by not being part of the EU ETS over the next few years, because there won't be much of an effective price signal anyway. What that does mean, people often object to linking in terms of the time it takes to establish linkage. And here you will have time to, you need time to establish a UK regime, you need time to link it. And in the case of Switzerland, which is clearly a much smaller system, that's taken a number of years. 2008 since the Swiss system started, I think 2011 first started talking about linking, and now it's just about happening. So it's probably going to take some time both to establish an ETS and to link it. But if you're not missing much in the meantime, I think the fact it may be delayed is not necessarily a good reason for not doing it. So I don't really take a view on whether that should be done, just that there is probably time to achieve that given what will be the weakness of the EU ETS over the next several years. I think that was about it. So on to questions, I think.
Brilliant. Thanks, Adam. It's really helpful and interesting. Okay, so we've got the opportunity for some further questions. Anyone here with some thoughts? All right, go ahead.
Will Flitson from Sandbank Company. I have a question to Ralf and Baran. You talked about the ETS having delivered emissions reductions. In Ralf and Mirabelle's paper, it refers to an identification problem. And I would suggest that identification problem, which refers to the fact that are the reductions because of the ETS or are they coinciding with the period of the ETS? And I would argue that it is the latter, because we've seen the case for a lot of industries based on their own data they appear to have either stalled on emissions reductions prior to the ETS or actually increased their specific emissions. That specific emissions, we're measuring that because it takes account for changes in growth production. So I've got a slight issue with the sort of assumption that goes into that claim.
Okay, so maybe Mirabelle, do you want to take the question?
So it's a good question, and that's actually the whole work we do when we try and use very fine-grained data on plants and firms in France and in Germany, and now we're working on UK and potentially Dutch data. And what we do is we compare two similar or a set of similar plants and firms. So it's as if you were testing a drug. You would take two similar patients, and one of them, you would give them the drug and see if it has an effect. Obviously, if both patients are feeling better for other reasons, then you would think, you can control for that more general reason. So in the case of the ETS, we take two similar sets of plants, but some are part of the ETS and some are not. And what we find is, both for France and for Germany, significant reduction by more than 10%. So this is looking at manufacturing firms. So, we're not saying anything about electricity or planes, but then, and it's also looking at only a subset of countries, but we still find this effect.
Okay, thanks for that explanation. Question over there.
Yeah, hi. I'm really interested in discussion today. I'd just like to think about how maybe some industries are reacting differently. So, for example, with, say, Shell, who I know a lot of people view as the bad guys, but they started with a very complicated internal scheme and went through various iterations until they realised the only way they could make it work internally was making it very simple, kind of flat $40 per tonne price. And say Norway offshore oil and gas, where they've gone to a price around $50 per tonne to actually make companies electrify from shore rather than gas turbines. If these kind of industries are having to set prices that are that high to actually change their behaviours, and they're trying to do that internally, do you really think with the prices around $5 at the moment, and as people have said it projected to not increase dramatically in the next 10 years. How can the EU ETS link to that industry-led effort to really implement the change that's needed?
Okay, great. Interesting observations about how Shell has also proceeded along this route, ended up at a $40 a ton. Maybe I'll ask Adam for your thoughts on that, and then Mirabelle and Baran.
I think you can see an example of that, exactly a higher carbon price really working well in the UK with carbon price support, where it's really helped drive coal off the system, which is a very cost-effective system. And by the way, that is real emissions reductions into the long term. The argument that's used against that really is not valid, which I can speak to if people are interested. So I agree with you that higher prices are very helpful, and we've got very clear evidence of that. It's why some of us think that a floor price in the EU ETS will be a very good idea. It's just been politically difficult. But I think there was an event at Davos where Nick Stern was presenting a survey he'd done of CEOs and etc. And they were all, essentially, almost all of them were agreeing you needed prices at those sorts of levels. I think it's clear you do. It's also, by the way, the social cost of carbon if you're thinking of I think it's Imperial. I'm allowed to say something like Pigouvian taxes as Imperial, aren't I? Yeah. If you think of Pigouvian prices, they're effectively pricing the externality. You need to be up at that sort of level. So I entirely endorse the wish to get there. It doesn't look like it's happening on the EU ETS. It's one thing the UK has done right, and it's proving immensely effective, and it's an example that should be followed.
Great, thanks, Adam. I don't know, anyone else on the panel have comments?
I think maybe I may just add that for a company to incorporate into its internal decision-making processes a carbon price at relatively high levels is a very different thing than for a politician to introduce a carbon tax at that price, at that level that the company uses, and remain in office. And I think this is precisely the reason why, despite being perhaps the more efficient option for regulating emissions, carbon prices are not picked up by as many governments as we would like it. And if we are living in that more practical world, we may be better off making what we have work better, carbon price floor, for example, in an ETS, than trying to force a policy that we know will work on paper, which may be the best policy, but has very little chance of being implemented.
Could I just come back with a couple of points in response to that? Firstly, there's quite an interesting graph in the World Bank State and Trends of Carbon Pricing report from last year, where they separate out prices under an ETS and under a carbon tax. All the high prices are under carbon taxes, as well as actually a lot of the low ones, but ETSs are all failing to produce adequate prices. I nevertheless think that an ETS with a floor price has advantages over a carbon tax for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the international architecture is a quantity-based architecture, and it allows us therefore an easier flow down from the international level if you've got some kind of quantity-based instrument. Secondly is, I think, the idea that there will be a long-term cap and that emissions are going to have to come down is a useful strategic signal for industry. And the final one is that actually, under sort of the kind of classical theory of environmental regulation, that there are good reasons to think that climate change is probably a threshold phenomenon, and that you really do want to stop going above a certain cumulative total of emissions. So for those three reasons, while I certainly value many of the advantages of carbon tax and stability, certainty, level and so forth, I think also a cap has some important advantages, and therefore the hybrid approach of a cap but with a price floor is probably actually the optimal solution. Not, in my view, not a second best to a tax. It's probably actually optimal.
Okay, great. Further questions? Yeah, Richard.
Probably
oh, sorry. I was pointing behind you. Sorry, you already did have a question.
So given the fact that the power generators need a higher carbon price to justify their low carbon investments, and Adam pointed
addresses the high emissions in the power generation sector. And given the fact that industry struggles with a higher carbon price, particularly in the short term because of potential carbon leakage not keeping up with technological developments, is it time to separate the two and have a separate system for power and compared to industry?
Anyone on separate systems or separate caps? Should I take a second question and allow you
I've got a couple of responses. Firstly, I think in a way, as I hinted, for the UK favour something broader. You can solve the industry problem if you want to, as essentially done at the moment by just free allocation. Border adjustments are another way to go. There are ways round that carbon leakage issue under a broadly drawn scheme for those industries at risk, and there are a few of them, but frankly they're a pretty small proportion of the economy, so it should not be driving, in my view, the wider design. It should be something you deal with for the relatively few companies which really do have a problem. And yeah, it's one of the things, for the economy it's not much of an issue. If it's your industry, it's a bigger issue. If you're, say, in aluminium, if it's your company, even more still, and if it's your job on the line, it really becomes a huge issue. But I think those difficulties, which are very real, can be dealt with effectively by essentially having a high marginal price but a low average price.
Great. Any further thoughts?
Okay. Can I ask if a different aspect on looking at understanding behaviour of industry would be to look at the driver of saving the cost of the energy itself? Because when you focus just on the cost of carbon, that's actually a relatively small proportion of the cost of the energy that's used. And in my experience, it's actually trying to save energy costs that actually drives behaviour change. And carbon is trying to address that, but the huge driver of the cost of energy is still there anyway.
Any thoughts on behaviour change in industry?
Well, I mean, I'm sure the energy price is a bigger part of the whole thing than the carbon price at the moment. But I mean, the basic problem arises because given the energy price, we pollute too much to prevent climate change. So we need to. It's just not enough. Of course, it's one of the drivers for how much you consume, but it's not enough of a driver. So we need to.
But if you're finding impacts of EU ETS, I would suggest the behaviour is actually driven by the total cost of energy, not the relatively low cost of EU ETS at say €5 a tonne.
Well, in our case, the results I showed, we think we can claim with some reason that it's actually driven by the carbon price, because we're comparing companies that have otherwise the same energy price, but the only thing that differs, I mean, of course, if you believe all our assumptions, I should always say, but that's what we aim to do, that we try to isolate the effect of the carbon price, and this is the effect of the carbon price. I also should say, I mean, I maybe to your earlier thing, of course, I don't believe that the €5 is a good scenario. Also, actually, Mirabelle and I did also a survey of almost 800 managers across Europe back in 2009. And at that time, they thought that by 2020 we'll have a carbon, on average. Of course, there were some people who thought it's nothing. Other people thought it's 500. But the average was €40 per ton of carbon. That's what they were thinking in 2009. So I believe a lot of what we're finding at the moment, I mean, this sort of dip you see in post 2008, that might be based on them expecting that by 2020 they have this carbon price and therefore doing investments. We find a sort of uptake in investment in that period as well. They're doing certain investments with that sort of long-term view. Of course, what's now happening, that the carbon price has dropped, is sort of everybody's guess, but that might be the situation there.
Certainly for grid electricity in the UK, the prices are going through the roof, and that's not just being driven by carbon.
I agree, yes.
Okay, we're sort of due to wrap up in a minute or so. Any last minute burning questions? Go ahead.
So there's a question about innovation. On the industrial side of the EU ETS and industrial players, something like 60-70% of all emissions really covered by approximately 3 sectors. So if the ETS is truly driving innovation, are you seeing, you would expect it to be mostly in those 3 sectors? So are you seeing differentiation between the amount of innovation driven by the ETS by sector? Or are you just seeing, or are you not looking at that level of granularity?
First of all, I wasn't looking, it was my colleagues who were looking. I don't think they were breaking it out yet by sector.
No.
I mean, they're looking at what we call clean innovations, and you might sort of agree or disagree with how they classify this, but it's probably this kind of sectors you have in mind, sort of power generation stuff and that sort of thing. But I don't think they report in their paper. Maybe we should tell them that it would be easy to do.
What could be interesting is also that you share your results on spillovers from innovation.
Okay. Well, but this is. I mean, in terms of why should we have unilateral climate policy if it only leads to competitiveness issues or something like that? I mean, what we were doing, what Mirabelle refers to, we were looking at the differences in the spillover between clean and dirty technologies using that same classification. And to our own surprise, we found that what we call knowledge spillovers in economics are much higher for clean technologies. So what does this mean? This basically means, yes, that initially, from having climate change policy, you might have a cost. But if your spillovers, if the technologies you're moving in, they create more spillovers, more sort of, inspiration of other inventors, you might have, at least theoretically, the sort of a necessary condition for this whole sort of thing to create. But I mean, a lot of politicians have said this, right? And I think initially they said it because it was a sort of opportunistic thing to say. But we have this sort of evidence which was initially sort of created to debunk this sort of statement by politicians, which actually showed it might be theoretically possible. Actually, if you, I mean, a priori I didn't think, well, I should have higher spillovers in wind turbines versus, I don't know, gas turbines. But overall of all of these clean technologies, there seems to be this sort of very strong and very clear gap in spillovers, and that might support a sort of a story like that.
Okay, good. So we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you, everyone, for your patience, interest, and very interesting questions on the subject matter. As I said, after the event, as all of you have registered to come along, we'll be sending you the link to the video and some of the associated papers, and feel free to be in touch if there's anything you want to know a little bit more about. Thank you. Good evening. Thanks again to the speakers.